The air in the Hilton ballroom was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the underlying tension of a business deal disguised as a celebration. I stood by the window, watching the sunset over the city, my silk bridal gown feeling less like a dream and more like a high-stakes uniform. My parents were across the room, huddled with my fiancé's family, their voices low but their gestures animated. They weren't discussing my happiness, they were discussing my price. I wonder, as you're listening to this, maybe while you're doing chores or driving home after a long shift, have you ever felt completely invisible to the people who are supposed to love you most? Have you ever realized that to your own blood, you aren't a person, but a commodity? My name is Elena. I'm 28 years old, and for the last 6 years, I've worked as a senior forensic accountant for one of the top firms in the country. My job is to find the money people try to hide, the ghost accounts, the offshore transfers, the paper trails that lead to the truth. I'm very, very good at what I do. My parents, Marcus and Sylvia, always viewed my career as a cute hobby until they realized how much I was actually earning. To them, I was the quiet, reliable daughter who stayed out of trouble and handled the family's digital life because technology is too confusing for them. Tonight was supposed to be my rehearsal dinner. I was set to marry Julian, a man from a prominent family whose prestige my parents were desperate to latch onto. But as I walked toward the bar to grab a water, I caught a snippet of their conversation. They didn't see me behind the heavy velvet pillar. "We agreed on the percentage, Richard," my father whispered to Julian's father. "Elena's dowry isn't just the cash. We're handing over the keys to the lakeside property as well. But in exchange, your firm needs to buy out my struggling logistics company at the inflated rate we discussed. This wedding is the bridge." My mother chimed in, her voice cold and analytical. "She's a compliant girl. She'll do what she's told. We've already moved her personal savings into the joint family trust for the transition. She won't even notice until after the honeymoon." I froze. They hadn't just negotiated my marriage. They had treated me like a line item in a merger. And more importantly, they had touched my money. They thought they were clever, using the power of attorney I'd signed years ago when my father had a health scare. They thought they had drained me to save their own failing reputation. What they didn't know was that I had seen the notification on my phone an hour ago, and they certainly didn't know that, as a forensic accountant, I keep tripwire protocols on all my assets. I didn't scream. I didn't make a scene. I simply turned around, walked back to my table, and took a long, slow sip of water. The compliant girl they thought they knew died in that moment. The woman who remained was someone who knew exactly where every cent of their life savings was hidden. The silence that followed their conversation was, for them, a comfortable one. For me, it was the sound of a fuse burning down. I watched my mother, Sylvia, adjust her pearl necklace in the mirror, her reflection radiating a smug satisfaction that made my skin crawl. She caught my eye and blew me a kiss. "You look radiant, darling. Just remember to smile more when Julian's partners arrive. First impressions are everything for the firm." "Of course, Mother," I said, my voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. "I'm focused on the long-term returns." She didn't even blink at the phrasing. She just assumed I was talking about my future husband's social standing. I retreated to a quiet corner of the bridal suite, pulling my laptop from my bag. They thought my work was a hobby, but it was my weapon. For years, I had managed my father's logistics company's digital accounts. He was old school. He trusted paper, but he needed me to navigate the encrypted portals of his offshore holdings and the family legacy trust he bragged about. As I logged in, the screen glowed with the cold reality of their betrayal. They hadn't just moved a small portion of my savings. They had effectively emptied my primary investment account into the joint family trust, a vehicle my father controlled entirely. It was nearly $400,000. My hard-earned life's work, intended for my own independence, was being used as collateral to bail out his failing business and grease the wheels for Julian's father's acquisition. But my father made one fatal mistake. He assumed that because he was the head of the household, his authority was absolute. He forgot who set up the security protocols for that trust. He forgot that every backdoor and recovery key was stored in my encrypted vault, not his. I watched the cursor blink. I could see the balance of the family legacy trust. Not just my stolen money, but the entirety of my parents' liquid assets. Everything they had scraped together, the proceeds from the sale of my grandmother's estate, and the emergency funds they had hidden from the taxman. It was all sitting right there, vulnerable. I began the process. It wasn't a hack. It was a simple, legal transfer based on the administrative privileges I already possessed. I initiated a series of layered movements, mirroring the very ghost accounts I investigated for a living. By the time the sun rose on my wedding day, that trust would be a hollow shell. Just then, my brother Leo walked in. He was the golden child, the one who had never worked a day in his life, but was slated to receive a consulting role in the new merged company. He leaned against the doorframe, a glass of expensive scotch in his hand. "Cheer up, Elle," he smirked. "You're doing a great thing for the family. Dad's really proud of how you've stepped up. Once the merger goes through, we're all set for life." "I'm glad you think so, Leo," I replied, my fingers flying across the keys one last time. "I'm making sure everyone gets exactly what they deserve." He toasted me and walked out, oblivious to the fact that I had just redirected the consulting fees he was counting on into a private account in the Cayman Islands that he would never touch. The hidden factor wasn't just my skill, it was their arrogance. They didn't think I had the spine to strike back. They thought the quiet daughter would just walk down the aisle and accept her fate. They were about to find out that when you push a forensic accountant, she doesn't just get even, she audits your soul. The morning of the wedding arrived with a deceptive golden calm. My mother burst into my suite at 7 a.m., trailed by a small army of makeup artists and hairstylists. She was vibrating with a frantic, greedy energy. To her, this wasn't the day her daughter started a new life. It was the day the wire transfer finally cleared. "Elena, sit up. We have to get the foundation perfect. Julian's mother is bringing the family tiara. It's a heavy responsibility, but you'll carry it well," she chirped, her eyes never leaving her phone. She was likely checking the joint family trust balance, waiting for the final confirmation of the merger's down payment. "I'll carry exactly what I need to, Mother," I replied. I sat perfectly still as they painted a mask of bridal bliss onto my face. Beneath the silk robe, my own phone vibrated in my pocket. A confirmation code. One final authorization. With a single tap through the fabric, I executed the sweep protocol. In less than 60 seconds, the $400,000 they stole from me, plus the $3 million of my parents' life savings, the emergency funds, and the legacy property liquefied assets, vanished from their reach. I didn't just take my money back. I took the floor out from under their entire world. By noon, we were at the church. The guest list was a who's who of the city's financial elite. Julian stood at the altar, looking handsome in a way that felt entirely manufactured. He didn't love me. He loved the bridge my father's company provided. I walked down the aisle, the heavy lace of my train whispering against the stone floor like a warning. As I reached the altar, I saw my father in the front row. He gave me a sharp, commanding nod, the look of a man who had just sold a difficult asset and was pleased with the closing price. The priest began the ceremony. "If anyone here knows of any reason why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony," usually this is a formality, a breath of silence before the I do. But I didn't wait for the priest to continue. I turned slightly, not toward Julian, but toward the front row where my parents sat. "I do," I said, my voice cutting through the hollow air of the cathedral. The priest blinked, confused. "Pardon me?" "I have a reason," I clarified, loud enough for the back pews to hear. I reached into the hidden pocket of my gown, and pulled out a single folded piece of heavy cardstock. It wasn't my vows. It was a printed ledger of the morning's transactions, stamped with the digital seal of my firm. Julian reached for my hand, his brow furrowed. "Elena, what are you doing? This isn't the time." "Actually, Julian, this is the perfect time. Because as of 8:14 this morning, the bridge my father promised your family has collapsed." I looked directly at my father, whose face was rapidly draining of color. "The family legacy trust is empty, Dad. The logistics company's accounts are frozen, and the dowry you negotiated behind my back, it's currently sitting in a private offshore account under my name, and mine alone." The murmur that rippled through the church was like a physical wave. My mother stood up, her pearls clacking against her chest. "Elena, stop this nonsense. You're tired, you're stressed." "I've never been more awake," I said, handing the ledger to Julian's father, who was sitting directly behind us. "Check the balances, Richard. You're merging with a ghost. My parents don't have a cent left to their names. They tried to sell me to save themselves, so I decided to buy my freedom with their future." The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of heavy, pressurized quiet that precedes a structural collapse. Julian's father, Richard, snatched the ledger from my hand, his eyes scanning the columns of red numbers with the predatory speed of a seasoned shark. Beside him, my father's face transitioned from a ghostly pale to a dangerous mottled purple. "Elena, what have you done?" my father roared, his voice echoing off the vaulted cathedral ceiling, shattering the sacred atmosphere. He took a step toward the altar, but I didn't flinch. I stood my ground, the heavy white silk of my dress suddenly feeling like armor rather than a shroud. "I did exactly what you taught me, Dad," I said, my voice low and steady, amplified by the church's acoustics. "I protected the assets. I just realized that I was the only asset worth protecting." Julian finally found his voice, though it sounded thin and reedy. "Elena, we can talk about this. The wedding, the guests, everyone is watching." I looked at him, really looked at him, for the last time. He wasn't worried about me. He was worried about the optics. He was worried about the merger that was currently evaporating in Richard's hands. "There is no wedding, Julian. There is no bridge," I said firmly. I reached up and unclipped the heavy family tiara my mother had obsessed over. It felt surprisingly light as I handed it to a stunned bridesmaid. "And there is certainly no dowry." Richard looked up from the paper, his face a mask of cold fury. He didn't look at me. He looked at my father. "Marcus, you told me the liquidity was guaranteed. This ledger shows a zero balance across every corporate and personal account. You brought me here to sign a contract with a man who is effectively bankrupt?" "She's lying! She's just emotional!" my mother shrieked, her carefully curated social mask finally cracking down the middle. She lunged for my arm, but I stepped back, letting her stumble on the altar steps. "It's all there, Richard," I said, ignoring her. "The routing numbers, the timestamps, and the legal proof of the joint family trust's dissolution. My father gave me administrative access years ago because he couldn't remember his own passwords. I simply used that authority to claw back what they stole from my personal accounts, and took a consulting fee for the years of emotional labor I've provided." The reversal of fortune was instantaneous. Julian's family began to stand, their movements synchronized and cold. They didn't offer comfort. They didn't offer a scene. They offered a withdrawal. "The deal is dead, Marcus," Richard said, his voice cutting through my mother's sobbing. "And so is the association. Julian, we're leaving." As the groom side of the church began to empty in a blur of black suits and expensive perfume, I felt a weight lift off my chest that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. My parents were left standing in the center of a hollowed-out dream, surrounded by floral arrangements they could no longer afford, and guests who were already texting the scandal to the rest of the city. I reached down, gathered up the heavy train of my dress, and began to walk. not toward the vestry to hide, but straight down the center aisle, past the rows of stunned faces. I didn't look back at the wreckage I had created. I was looking toward the heavy oak doors at the end of the hall, where the bright midday sun was waiting. The heavy oak doors swung open, and for the first time in my life, the air felt thin and clean. Behind me, the muffled sounds of my father's desperate explanations and my mother's wailing faded into a dull hum. I didn't wait for a car. I didn't wait for a happily ever after with a prince. I simply walked down the stone steps, the train of my dress gathering the dust of the city, and hailed a taxi. I directed the driver to a small, quiet hotel near the airport, not the honeymoon suite I was supposed to be in. Once inside, I stripped off the silk and lace, leaving the gown in a heap on the floor. It was just fabric now. I changed into a pair of jeans and a sweater, feeling more like myself than I had in years. The silent revenge isn't about the explosion. It's about the quiet that follows. I spent the evening watching the sunset, knowing that my parents would be spending theirs answering calls from creditors and lawyers. By taking the money, I hadn't just secured my own future. I had stripped them of the only thing they used to hurt people, their influence. Without the family trust, they were just two people who had forgotten how to be a family. I realized then that peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's the presence of boundaries. I blocked their numbers, redirected my mail, and prepared to move to a city where nobody knew me as the compliant daughter. I was starting over, not as a line item, but as the author of my own story. Thank you for listening to my journey. It's a reminder that no matter how invisible you feel, you always have the power to change the narrative. If you enjoyed this story of vindication and finding one's own voice, please give this video a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Comment below with your own stories of setting boundaries or walking away from a toxic situation. I read every single one. And don't forget to subscribe to Silent Revenge Lab for more stories of quiet strength and ultimate justice. Until next time, stay strong, stay silent, and stay empowered.